Beautiful, thank you. I wrote this at 5 o'clock this morning, so I don't even know how much of it I'll read, but I'll read some of it. First of all, I'd like to thank, obviously, Oakthorn, but also Maurice MacGowan, because so much of Shane is obviously you. You know what I mean? Like, he's so like you, he was so like you. And I really appreciate you, Maurice, your contribution to having created him. And obviously your beloved wife, Shane's mother, Therese, and all of your ancestors. Because Shane was so proud of his ancestors, and he spoke about them all the time, and he sometimes communicated with them. And he just, you know, I've never really met anyone with so much love, respect, admiration and appreciation for his own family. So thank you, the MacGowans and the Lynches and all the other ancestors. And I guess everybody who knew Shane knew how much he hated funerals, huh? It was very hard to get him to go to a funeral. There were very few that he did go to. I guess his mother's funeral, Ronnie Drew's funeral, but very few others. He didn't like the idea of death. He didn't want to talk about his own death, ever. He didn't believe he was going to die, ever. When I met Shane, when we got together, people started telling me that he would be dead within about 6 months because he was such a, you know, hard drinker, and he always assured me that he would live to be at least 80. So we were both very, very, I think it took us by surprise, it took all of us by surprise, because we really did believe, didn't we, that he would come home. So it was a huge shock. Yeah, I mean, like, what can I say about that? But even though he didn't like the idea of death, he was what I call a cosmonaut. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit because I was thinking about this. So, and I might go back to this bit. When I say a cosmonaut, what I mean is that he was a kind of person who wasn't really that interested in living a normal life. You know, he didn't want a 9-to-5 job or a mortgage or any of that stuff. What he liked to explore all aspects of consciousness. He liked to explore where you could go within your mind. So he wasn't like one of those people who climb mountains or drive racing cars or any of that stuff, but he did do the equivalent with his mind. And obviously, he chose many, many, many mind-altering substances to help him on that journey of exploration. And he really did live so close to the edge that he seemed like he was going to fall off many times. I mean, we've had me and Siobhan and all the family. We've kind of lived in terror, haven't we, for a very long time. But on the plus side, I think that exploration led to a kind of creativity which may not have been possible without the use of all these substances. So I mean, I used to watch him in his various states, communicating with dragons. You know, there was a time when I came home and the toilet had been locked for a few hours, and Big Charlie, who we lived with, was trying to go to the loo, and he said, "Look, Shane's been in the toilet for at least 3 hours, can you try and get him out?" So we were banging on the door, and he said, "I'm talking to James Clarence Mangan, can you go away?" So he had been talking to James Clarence Mangan, the poet, he's a famous Irish poet, for 3 hours, and by the end of maybe 5 hours, he had a song called "London, You're a Lady," which had been dictated to him by James Clarence Mangan. And another time, I came home, and he was in the attic, and I climbed up the ladder, and I was like, "Shane, what are you doing in the attic?" And he said, "I'm talking to Freddy Krueger." Freddy Krueger's in the attic. Freddy Krueger is one of Johnny's characters. And so, you know, he had this ability to completely just trip out. Everybody here probably knows the story about when the Pogues were supposed to support Bob Dylan in America. And Frank Murray rang me and said, I'm not allowed to say the word F, but where the F is Shane, he's supposed to be at the airport. So we banged on the door. We finally got the door open. Shane was coming down the stairs with blood dripping out of his mouth, holding a Beach Boys record which he had been eating. And he said to us, I've just been having a summit meeting with all of the world leaders, and I've been giving them caviar and Marmite sandwiches, and I'm trying to get world peace. So, I haven't got time to go to the airport. And he'd eaten the Beach Boys record to demonstrate the cultural inferiority of the United States. But he really wanted to point out it wasn't Pet Sounds. It wasn't Pet Sounds that he ate. And okay, so I think, in a way, when I first got together with him, he used to carry an encyclopedia of pharmacology. Do you guys remember that? Spider, Siobhan, do you remember the encyclopedia of pharmacology he carried? I can't remember the name of it, but it had every drug that had ever been made listed and what they do to you. And so anytime anybody had any kind of pill, even a painkiller, he'd say, I just want to look that up in my... And then he would decide if he wanted to take it or not. So, yeah, he explored. He was an explorer in lots of ways, like William Burroughs or Hunter Thompson. But he explored the boundaries of what you can do while you're still in a physical body. And his physical body lasted a very long time, considering what he did to it. There was a time when he was taking 100 tabs of acid a day. I have no idea how a human being could survive that. What else was I going to say? He was creating music and lyrics all the time that he was doing this. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at the drawings that he did, but some of them, they're incredibly... It's like you can feel where he went. It's like he traveled in space, and you can feel where he went by looking at the drawings. They're really evocative, and I think he was a brilliant artist in the visual sense, as opposed as not just as a lyricist. And when he was writing, he was also drawing, and it all came out. It just came tumbling out. I remember when he wrote Summer in Siam, we were in Thailand on holidays, and he'd taken some what they call Thai white. And I'm not going to elaborate on that, just in case anyone is sensitive here. But so he wrote Summer in Siam on a crappy little Casio that he bought in one of the local shops in Thailand. But it sounded it's just like he could hear it. I couldn't hear it because it sounded like a crappy little Casio to me, but he could hear Summer in Siam, which is one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard. So his mind was just capable of going to these places that normal minds don't go to. And, I give thanks for that. I feel that he's created and contributed something very special to our canon. And he may have had to sacrifice a great deal to do that. But, to my mind, it was worth it. And I'm just going to move on to the religious aspect, because I think that's very important as well. So, Shane, he didn't just like to go to the dark places and the weird places. He also liked to go to the more blissful, transcendent, and spiritual places. And he could go there with music, and quite often he would go there by listening to music. So one of our favorite things to do was to listen to Astral Weeks. And we could listen to Astral Weeks for 8 hours at a time. And we'd just be sitting there listening to Astral Weeks all day. And we'd just both be in a state of pure bliss. So I think we probably had that in common, that, music could take us places that were so heavenly that it was like God. I think music in a way was like God to Shane and John Coltrane and various other musicians. It really was his way of communicating God. But he was intensely religious. We all know that about him. I've met a lot of priests in my time, and I don't know about you guys, but I have yet to meet one who genuinely believes that he is imbued with Christ when he takes the communion. But Shane got an actual physical, visceral buzz out of the Holy Communion, which was almost as good as a drug for him. He just loved it. He absolutely loved it. And one of the funny things that happened in the hospital was that we had the Holy Communion in a little receptacle on his hospital table, you know. And one of the priests came in, and I said, "Oh, nice that you came in. Shane's very religious. You know, he'll be delighted to see you. He takes the Holy Communion every day." And the priest was horrified, and he said, "What do you mean? How can he possibly take the Holy Communion every day? Where does he get it?" And I said, "Well, you know, he just gets it. Like, I'm not going to tell you where he gets it from. I'm going to reveal his source." But so the priest said, "Well, that's illegal. You're not allowed to have the Holy Communion. You know, that's sacred, whatever. It's meant to be in one of those things, like that thing up there." So the priest had to confiscate his Holy Communion. And I thought, he must be the only man in the world who's been busted for Holy Communion. Shane prayed every single day. He was very grateful to be alive. He was grateful for the gift of life. Every morning when he woke up, he gave thanks and prayed to God for giving him another day. And he also prayed for people, all kinds of people, all the time, every day, all day. And I thought it was funny because he sometimes, and actually quite often, prayed for people on television and in films who were actors who weren't really dead at all. They were just acting dead, but he'd still be praying for them. And, you know, he'd just be covering all bases, just in case. It was just very beautiful. His devotion was very beautiful, but it was also very radical. I think, in a sense, he reinvented Irish music and made it into a very different thing, but he also reinvented religion and made that into a very different thing, because he believed in a God who could be also called Allah. He could also be called the Tao. You know, he could be called by any of the names that we in the world use to describe God. He was into Taoism very much. He read a lot of Alan Watts. He read a lot of Eastern philosophy. He read a lot about Zen Buddhism. He read the Mahabharata. He read the Quran. He loved the Quran. So he loved and respected every religious text he could get his hands on. I think that's pretty unique. And I suppose he distilled the essence of that into love. I mean, he just loved humanity, and he believed that God is love. And ultimately, God is compassion, and God is forgiveness. So Shane, although in the early days when I first met him, he was a little bit slow to forgive the Brits, he kind of came round to it, you know, and he started to really, really, really forgive everybody, everything, immediately. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, Johnny, but when Johnny had a court case involving his ex-wife, Amber, and Shane had a long conversation with you, didn't he, and urged you to forgive Amber. Yeah. He just thought it was the best thing to do, because he just believed genuinely in forgiveness. And I'm sure you have by now, haven't you? Of course you have. Of course you have. But yeah, he just wouldn't hold a grudge against anyone. He just wouldn't see the bad in anyone. He just, and particularly towards the end, he became, like, you know, when I first met him, he wasn't really, he was very much a humanitarian and a socialist, and he loved people. But he didn't necessarily demonstrate that to his friends, always. He could be quite cantankerous and rude and, you know, sometimes hostile. And I'm sure the Pogues will attest to that. but towards the end, he just told everybody how much he loved them. Like, nurses in the hospital were almost like shocked because he would say, "I love you," and he'd never even met them before. But he'd just say, "I love you." He loved, like, obviously, Zakiti, who's here today. She shared a beautiful piece of information with me, which is that Shane was the first person to have told her that he loved her. And I just think, you know, for so many people, he was just so full of love that, and I'm feeling so much love now from him that I don't think he can go away. I don't think love can go away, can it? I really just don't. Yeah. I mean, I guess you know he always wore a crucifix, and he always had a bunch of scapulars, and sometimes they were he had so many religious medals and scapulars that they turned into this kind of a mess around his neck. It was like this big blob of medals and scapulars. So I think he was trying to convey to people that there is something in this stuff. You know, there's something in Jesus that's worth thinking about, it's worth valuing, it's worth exploring, that Jesus is real, it's a real force. Jesus is a real force, and love is real. And it transcends all barriers of race, class, you know, nationality, any of that stuff. It's just everything. Love is everything. And for me, you know, obviously my relationship with him was a romantic relationship, but even though, you know, obviously when you meet somebody and you fall in love, there's kind of very much it's about a physical thing, but for me it wasn't, it was like weird because I think I fell in love with his soul, like straight away. I just saw this soul shining at me, and I felt like we were absolutely destined to be together. We were destined to, and it took a few years because I met him when I was 16. And we didn't get together until I was 20. But there was just like a magnet pulling me to him. And when he first told me that he loved me, I remember it was, you guys were going on tour, the Pogues were going on tour, and I think, no, you weren't going on tour, you were going to Spain to make a film, a really crappy film, called Straight to Hell, which we won't say any more about. But that night, the night before he left, he said, "I love you." And I said, "I love you." And he said, "I know." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Oh, because you said it in your sleep the other night." And so, it was just, to me, I felt like I'd won the lottery, and I felt like there was nothing more that my life needed in order to be complete than to be with him. And I'm very grateful. And I think that, you know, obviously, I loved his physical body, and I loved his presence, and I loved his smile, and I loved his voice, and I loved the fact that like 50 times a day we would laugh at each other and smile at each other and say "I love you" to each other, and say, you know, we used to say, I'm so glad to see you. And like we said that even though we'd been in the room together all day, we'd still say, "I'm so glad to see you." And I have yet to meet a couple who have that, you know, that gift. I still have not yet met a couple, no matter how successful or glamorous or whatever they are, good looking, you know, I just haven't met anyone else who has that connection. So it would be greedy really to want more than we got. You know, we got so much. And I know, of course, I'm going to miss him. I've been like devastated, and I'm going to be crying and crying and crying. But at the same time as crying and feeling devastated, I think it's possible to also feel that my heart has got bigger. And it's got so much bigger as a result of our relationship that it can never really go back. Like, I can never go back to being the kind of person I was before I met him. And another just beautiful thing about Shane, and I think you said this, Father Pat, is that he could never pass a homeless person without stopping and pulling out a wad of cash and giving them a cigarette or whatever it was they wanted. And he would never in any way judge them or patronize them or, you know, if they wanted a drink, he would give them a drink. He totally respected their choice, their freedom of choice. And I think that's a very beautiful thing, because we're very quick to judge in our society people who are marginalized and people who live on the street and think, oh, you know, it must be somehow their own fault. They must have, like, that addiction is somehow their own fault. So I think he also did something very powerful for addiction and for people with addiction, in that he demonstrated that it's possible to be a multiple drug abuser, like not just an alcoholic, but an absolutely multiple, every kind of drug known to man. There wasn't a single drug he didn't take. And to still be a genius and a beautiful soul and make a massive contribution to the world and be loved. So, like, next time you see somebody who you are thinking that guy's, oh, just an alcoholic or a drug addict, stop. Give thought to it and just let yourself just consider giving a bit of compassion and respect to that person. That would be my final message. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Siobhan.